Hi, and welcome to another session, Searching for Answers. We're searching our way through the first letter to Timothy in the New Testament, and we're just so glad you're here with us because you're the most important part of the program. As a discussion panel this evening, we have Dr. Leo Rancelin, who is Professor of New Testament Studies and Associate Dean of the School of Religion here at Loma Linda University. Welcome aboard. Glad to have you with us. And Dr. Catherine Coe, who walks in two worlds at Loma Linda University, the world of history and the world of religion, which is really kind of one world after all, isn't it? Dr. Coe is with us this evening representing history of Christian thought and the Bible. And so we'll get into that together and see how it goes. Grab your Bibles, whatever translation works well for you, English or other. We tend to use the New Revised Standard, but we don't necessarily limit ourselves to that. And find 1 Timothy in the New Testament, find the longer book of Hebrews, the Epistle to the Hebrews, and back up a few pages, and you'll find 1 Timothy. Chapter 3 is where we've been. This letter addressed to the young pastor Timothy at Ephesus, who is got his hands full, right? He's got some challenges to deal with. But they have to do not only with his time, but there are implications for our Christian walk in our time today. Chapter 3, last time we looked at the opening paragraph, there was a kind of a description of what the life of an overseer, a bishop, a pastor should look like. So Dr. Leo, pick this up and take us down through it a little bit and help us kind of recover a bit.
As you nicely note, last time we took a look at the bishops and overseers.
Yeah.
The focus was very much on the qualities that these persons ought to have within the life of the church. Not necessarily the responsibilities. But what does come through, I think, is that this person ought to have administrative abilities and be an apt teacher, if one were to speak of some responsibilities. But by and large, it has to do with these moral qualities that is needed in this person who's in leadership. And so then now we come to deacons in verse 8. And shall I read from 3:8 to verse 13?
It kind of echoes a little bit, doesn't it? But there are some differences.
Yes. So here we go, chapter 3, verse 8 and following. Deacons likewise must be serious, not double-tongued, not indulging in much wine, not greedy for money. They must hold fast to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them first be tested. And then if they prove themselves blameless, let them serve as deacons. Women likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be married only once, and let them manage their children and their households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and great boldness in the faith that is in Christ Jesus.
Yeah. And maybe we should just begin by noticing quickly verse 11, where the address shifts to women. This may be wives, it may be female deacons,
yes.
Right? Maybe deaconesses.
Yes.
So let's back up and see what jumps out at us here.
Well, again, very similar to what we saw with bishops and overseers, focus on the qualities of this person. And again, needing to demonstrate some administrative abilities. And what comes through is, apparently, if one manages one's household well, that's indicative of them having administrative abilities and some leadership qualities that can be manifest in the life of the church.
Yeah.
But if I could say, I'm struck by these two bishops and deacons, that we are here in a portion of the letter that gets at church administration and leadership in the church. And as I read this letter with care, I notice that in other parts there's concerns about not appointing elders too hastily making sure that if any accusations come against them, that they are handled properly, that they receive appropriate financial remuneration. And here what comes through in chapter 3 is a profound concern that leaders need to have certain qualities in order to function efficiently in the life of the church. So I wonder if leadership was an issue at Ephesus.
You got to
right?
wonder, don't you?
And so much attention being given to these matters that it looks like it may well have been a problem and destabilizing the church and adversely impacting the life of the church.
Well, there are some hints, both within the Bible and beyond the Bible, that the church at Ephesus had some rocky times.
Yes.
What do you think?
I was just going to say this really does harken back to chapter 1, where he's talking about a community. What kind of people do you want at the head of this community? And you want people who have good people skills. He's talking about elders. He talks about hospitality, which is typically something, typically a virtue you see assigned to women, interestingly enough. He talks about deacons, that they need to not be malicious. They shouldn't be fond of sordid gain. So they're not someone who's going to cheat other people. They're not going to get drunk and say things they ought not to do.
Right.
So he's looking at people who are both individually moral, but also treat their community around them in ways that are kind and welcoming and enveloping, because this book is about creating this community and healing this community that seems to have gone through something that has tested everyone's faith and unity.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that, John, to me a key verse is 3:15, right? It's almost the thesis statement of the letter, where Paul wants Timothy to know how one ought to behave in the household of God.
Yeah.
And so appropriate conduct within the household of God is of the utmost importance here. And that does look like it's really happening here. And if I were to connect some of the other portions with respect to false teachers and false teaching, you've got these teachers who apparently don't have appropriate knowledge, engaged in meaningless talk, profane myths and old wives' tale, myths and endless genealogies. It looks like, this is again me now, this esoteric kind of strange group of people within the church engaged in some kinds of weird and false teaching
kind of
that are also destabilizing the church. And I think that also gets at leadership, right? And so chapter 3 really gets at, hey, we've got to have people who got great administrative abilities, are great teachers to ensure the well-being of the household of God.
Absolutely. And I love that imagery of the household, because when you think of a Roman household, a domus, at this time period, that is the central community. That is the core community for most people during this time period. So much so that there were not separate cemeteries for hundreds of years between Christians and pagans, but rather you were buried with your household no matter what your religious beliefs were. So the household is this kind of core community within Roman society. And so no matter what religion you assigned yourself to, if you ran a good household, you would have a good reputation. And saying that the household of God should have a good reputation, connecting those two concepts, that's going to be a very familiar image for people at Ephesus. I also wanted to just point out one other thing, if I may. It says, he must have a good reputation, says verse 7. He must have a good reputation with those outside the church, so that he will not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Those outside the church. So much early Christian literature is actually written to those outside of the church. You think of the writings of Justin Martyr, for example. And so this idea that we need to be a good example, not just for one another to create this beautiful community, but also to have the outside community look at us and say, this is something admirable. There's something there that's quite special. And I think that's fascinating, that so much of this is done for the sake of people who are on the outside looking in.
You know, yeah, it's a double, this knife cuts two ways, doesn't it? Skillful, you know, genuinely able to manage things. There's that. But then there's that larger kind of affect about just being decent and respectable, you know? And it, as you've caught very well, Katie, in verse 7, thought well of by outsiders, that's kind of the summative sentence for this first paragraph, chapter 3, 1 to 7. Similar note at the end of the second paragraph, dealing with deacons, 8 through 13, good standing, gain a good standing. And again, I think this is in great degree turning the mirror, you know, and saying, how do you look to yourself? How do you look to the outsiders? You know, when Paul writes to the church at Corinth and says, in your worship experience, folks, let's not be too very enthusiastic in a way that, because there were these cults, weren't there, in the Roman Empire? There were these little groups and sectarian kind of movements in which there was a good deal of over-enthusiasm, shall we say. And there was a tendency for people walking by outside to say, oh, we know what they're doing in there. They're,
Right.
you know, and I think Paul is trying to find some middle ground here, but maybe pull things to the right a little bit.
Right.
When he says in Corinth, do all things decently in order. Yeah. What will the neighbors think? That is one of his, I think, unspoken criteria, and he's got it here as well.
Yeah.
It's one thing, on the one hand, these should be people who keep their cars washed and their lawns mowed, you know.
Right.
But it goes beyond that even, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
God is not a God of disorder, but of
Yeah.
Yes. And
1 Corinthians 14.
Yeah.
And when you think of what Christians were being persecuted for in the first centuries as well, it was for being considered godless, because they were, like, the concept of monotheism was not seen as really having much of a religion at all. And so they are kind of trying to prove themselves that, you know, we're not trying to get out of anything here. Or alternatively, there were rumors that Christians would eat children. I mean, all sorts of crazy things.
Right.
So
Horrible stories.
yes, so not just being good, but also looking good. I mean, people talk about, you know, you look good on the outside, but you also have to be good. But he's saying, be good and look good.
Right.
Not just for the sake of witness, which is incredibly important, but also for preservation of life, and for being able to worship, really.
Yeah.
As you, to add to the household of God, the Roman household, I'm struck by how some aspects of this letter are addressed specifically to make sure that their own Roman household operates appropriately, because there's a reference to slave disrespecting their masters. Perhaps some children aren't taking care of the widows of their household. And so there's some specific things that are directed to their own Roman household, and yet there's some overlap with the household of God. And the household of God is not subsumed, but it's related to it and analogous to it, and yet distinct from it. But I think, to me, you know, Paul's deeply concerned that you've got, during the worship service, men with angry disputes, perhaps women exercising inappropriate authority. And so this witness, as you say, to outsiders is perhaps being compromised by this kind of inappropriate, in his eyes, activity of what's happening within the household of God. And for him, that's problematic because, as you said, John, the household of God must have order and stability and a good witness to outsiders.
Those are all key factors in and of themselves. That should be right. It's common sense in a certain way, given the lists of good things and bad things, vices and virtues that we know Roman homes sometimes had posted on their walls. But there's even more. It helps us, I think, to bear in mind the fact that somewhere along in this time, we don't know the dating exactly, but it's late first century or so, at least in the form in which we have it now. But even during Paul's own lifetime, the winds of persecution are beginning to blow. Paul himself may have been martyred during the first earliest period of Roman persecution under Nero. Now, when we remind ourselves of that, it adds another whole layer to this thing, doesn't it? Hurried and harried and distracted and impatient Roman magistrates out in these various cities, Ephesus and elsewhere, puzzled by this, early on trying to figure out what to do with these. Who are these Cristianos?
Right.
What do we do with them? We even have examples later of correspondence between local rulers and the emperor, saying, "What do you do with these? How do we manage these Christians?" It's a lot easier for an impatient and rather dismissive magistrate to throw people who are regarded as riffraff into the lions in the arena next Sunday afternoon or whatever, than people who are pillars, upright members of society, who are people of some renown and respect, and who make a good contribution to the economics and the name and fame of a local area, district, or city. That too could have been a functional kind of aspect of all of this that might have been playing a little in the background, maybe? We don't know. We may not have quite that problem today, thanks be. But nonetheless, all of this still holds water for us in an interesting way, doesn't it? How are we to be seen by those outside of the household of God? Yeah.
Well, I think that's a fantastic question, and it cuts to the heart of, why we read Scripture. We're trying to find a way in this life as Christians.
Yes.
And, what you're saying is absolutely true. At least a little past this time. Peter Brown has written in his book on early Christianity about Christian persecutions, and that a large portion of that over time was really property disputes, but then they'd find out that the person was a Christian that they're disputing with, and then get thrown in jail for being a Christian, but that never would have come up if they hadn't had the property dispute. So people kind of using it as a secondary bullet, as it were, towards their neighbors. And I think that that's important for us now too, that when we're dealing with people, no matter if they're in the same community that we're in, they have the same belief system, it's important to be kind and hospitable and to not gossip. Christianity is not a club. It's a way of doing life and a community that you belong to, yes, but one that's meant to be welcoming and loving rather than one that's out to hurt you or out to hurt people that are not part of that specific little group.
Yeah. Quick little story. Previous incarnation, years and years ago, an earlier chapter in my life, I worked in a department store in downtown Walla Walla, Washington. That was then. and the manager was regularly called upon by cashiers and salespeople in the various departments if a customer wanted to write a check. The policy was you had to ask the manager to come and approve that check. Well, the managers, there were several of them during my time there, they had some turnover, didn't know what to do with that requirement. It was a company regulation. But they knew that in many cases, the salespeople knew the customer. Manager would regularly then, when a salesperson or head of a department asked manager to come approve a check, the manager would say, do you know this person? Yes, maybe, likely. Walla Walla wasn't that big a place. There are lots of SDAs there. The next question I noticed the manager would regularly ask, is this person a Seventh-day Adventist? Isn't that interesting? And regularly, if the cashier or the salesperson said, yes, he is or she is, the person writing this check, he would endorse it immediately. I don't know if it always worked out. I certainly hope so. But it was enough of a factor that it stuck with me. And I've never forgotten that. So here we are. Some of these principles still apply today, clearly. I'm suggesting. But married only once, or husband, what do we make of these? Literally, husband of one wife in the Greek, in the original. Any particular interest in this? How are we to translate it? And how should our viewers understand it?
Yeah.
Any of you viewers have to say?
Well, as you look at this here, you have to be careful not mirror read too, right?
Yeah.
But then I see not double-tongued and not indulging. Not indulging much wine. Does that mean there were some really caustic drunkards romping around in the household of God? Does that mean there were quite a few that were married numerous times that also compromised the witness of the church to outside? I mean, I always strive to ascertain the social setting
Exactly.
of a letter.
Exactly.
And the deeper I get into it, the more struck I am by, wow, this church really had its challenges.
Yes.
And I mean, there are multiple ways to look at it. You can look at it as they've only been married once. They are only currently married to one wife rather than to two wives. They were married and widowed and should not marry again, which would kind of mirror with chapter 5. Or you could just look at it as preservation of energy. That, you're trying to maintain a household, and you have so much energy for your household and so much energy for your Christian community, and it seems like one spouse makes things very simple in life. It also keeps you from having more disagreements, perhaps, in your house, because, two spouses to one spouse can be a problematic formula. So I think that it just doesn't feel like the text is completely clear on what it's trying to say, but the underlying concept is that you should not do something in your society that would be looked upon as being possibly morally problematic or problematic for creating harmonious human interaction.
Yeah.
And any of those definitions would fit with that.
I think we've got the picture. We're going to have to keep this picture in mind as we move on. There's a certain strictness about this, and yet later on we're going to encounter some strictnesses that are sort of modified a little. So here we go. Anything else on this before we go on?
Underscore the point. Deep concern for capable leadership.
Wise.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wise, seasoned, not newly converted, grounded in the Orthodox faith.
Yeah.
So that.
And all of that, on that level, applies today, doesn't it?
That's right.
Dr. Katie, help us with this next little paragraph of 3 verses, 14 through 16. Take us down through that, and let's see what we make of it in the last few moments here.
I am writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long, but in case I am delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. By common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was revealed in the flesh was vindicated in the spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory.
Yeah. What strikes you here? I
think that you need, I mean, there's so much. There really is.
It is pregnant, isn't it? These 3 verses.
It is. So I'll just start at the beginning. It seems like this is urgent, very much so. There's an aspect to what's going on in the church of Ephesus that cannot be delayed. He needs to get this letter to them before something disastrous happens, or to heal whatever disastrous that has happened as quickly as possible. And you do feel that urgency throughout the letter, certainly. Again, how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God. There were very strict rules within the Roman Domus of who did what and how life was to be conducted. So again, you see this mirroring, this parallel with the daily life that people understood, whether they came from a Jewish background or whether they came from a Gentile's background. So he's speaking a common language here. It's sort of like Jesus using the idea of the mustard seed as the smallest seed. It's not the smallest seed. And he's not necessarily saying that we live in one big house, but he's using this metaphor in order to help people understand that order must be made in order for this to work.
And when they do gather together, it is in somebody's house, and so there's another kind of reinforcement of it. But yes, it's a kind of a strong appeal to the family sense, isn't it?
Yes.
So here we are. Leo, in the last verse, we've got these passive verbs. Revealed in the Spirit, vindicated, seen, proclaimed among the nations, or the Gentile, believed in, taken up. What does that tell us about this measured cadence here in verse 16?
It looks like it might have been a hymn.
Could have been a hymn, right.
Confessional statement.
A confessional statement, yeah.
Looks like it, doesn't it?
There's every likelihood that if this was being read aloud in church, and these standard, well-known phrases begin to emerge, people could join in and start singing along. Eh? Maybe so. And one just naturally, at the end, then one just wants to naturally add an amen at the end. Isn't it? It just calls for it, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, we don't know much about the early confessions of faith, but we know that they were straightforward, and that they didn't have too many points. But the Trinity is there.
And we're going to see these all through the pastorals.
We shall.
These confessional statements.
Yeah.
These hymns.
These are things that are important
Yes.
for their faith. These are
Keystone.
markers. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, he's just spoken of the pillars. Well, here's a few of the pillar points, right, along the way. Yeah. So here we go. There's much more that we can mine out of the text here, but Jesus is the center. Father, Spirit, but in their daily lives, it's Jesus who really carries this forward for them. We'll consider these things further some more next time as we join around the circle, searching for answers.